Ladies and gentlemen, most people, I suppose, regard Stalin as a monster. Khrushchev said of him, like Peter the Great, he fought barbarism with barbarism. Yet for a tyrant, he was curiously unobtrusive, almost unassertive. At the time of the Bolshevik Revolution, though Stalin played a part, it was a modest one. And another participant, looking back, says, all I remember of Stalin is that he seemed like a grey blur, someone you would hardly notice against the landscape. Curiously enough, of all the warlords that I've talked about, I'm going to talk about, he was the only one who saw high service in the First World War, or rather in the wars of intervention that followed it. He commanded, he protected, he saved Tsaritsyn, which as a result became known as Stalingrad. He served in Poland, and one striking thing about him, he was extremely insubordinate. He took little notice of the instructions he received from the Commissar for War, Trotsky. He even took little notice of the instructions he received from the leader of the whole revolution, Lenin. He went his own way. He stood up for himself. This was not conduct which he would have tolerated from generals in the Second World War. It was not until 10 years after the Bolshevik Revolution that he had maneuvered himself into supreme power. And from then, 1928, until a few weeks before the Second World War penetrated Russia, he remained simply secretary of the Communist Party. Officially, he had no governmental position whatsoever. But there can be no doubt that from 1928, he was dictator of Russia. During this period, his rule became increasingly harsh. He arrested people by the thousand, perhaps by the million. He liquidated, as the phrase was, all his old political associates. He liquidated practically the high command of the Soviet army. And thus, in 1939, when the Second World War began, Stalin stood alone, solitary, with nobody whom he respected, nobody whose opinions he received, puzzled, suspicious, hardly aware of the problems of what was going on outside. His one anxiety, and it was a profound appreciation, which was to continue throughout the Second World War, his one anxiety was the realization that if there were a great European war against Germany in which Russia was involved, simply because of the facts of the case, it was Russia which would have to do most of the fighting. This was true even in the First World War, and of course it was far truer in the Second. From the time that Russia came into the war, the Russians contended most of the time with 4/5 of the German army, and never with less than 3/4. Stalin's only anxiety, therefore, was to keep out of war. There are those who speak slightingly of the way he made a Nazi-Soviet pact, a pact of neutrality with Hitler in September 1939, August 1939. But of course, again, his sole anxiety was to keep out of war as long as he could, and he misjudged. He believed that Great Britain and France would keep a West Front going for a long time, that Russia would have time to prepare. And as France fell, as Great Britain was on her own, he continued to believe, and it was one of the obsessions of his mind, that Hitler would not actually attack Russia until he had finished with Great Britain. Thus he thought he would have enough time. Stalin undoubtedly was preparing for war, anticipating a German attack from the time that France fell in June 1940. Unfortunately, many of his preparations were misplaced. He believed, and continued to believe for a long time, that attack, all-out offensive, was the only answer to invasion. He grouped the Russian armies all along the frontier so that they could begin their victorious march to Berlin. In fact, they had to wait for 4 years. In the early days, early months of 1941, somebody has calculated, Stalin received no less than 76 separate warnings that Germany was about to invade Russia. They came from the American government, the British government, they came from Stalin's own secret agents all over Europe. They came from practical indications of the mobilization of the German forces. But as so often happens with statesmen, he had formed a picture. Right till the last moment, he continued to say, Hitler is going to threaten us, he is going to exact greater concessions from us, but as long as he has Great Britain to contend with, he will not invade us. Even when, on the 22nd of June 1941, even when the German troops were actually crossing the frontier, at first he refused to allow his generals to fight back. And when, in the course of the day, the whole Russian front collapsed, all the reply they could get from Moscow was, the boss knows best. The boss did not know best for a long time after the first German attacks. Indeed, I think you can say all through the summer of 1941, the boss did not know best. But Stalin's great achievement was to learn, though belatedly, from experience, and in the later days of the war, as I shall seek to show, the boss really did know best. In a technical sense, it's fascinating how Stalin piled one position of authority on the other. Just before the German invasion, for the first time, he took a political position. He became chairman of the Council of People's Commissars, or as we should say, prime minister. When the war started, he first of all appointed himself Commissar for Defense, then he appointed himself Commander-in-Chief, then he appointed himself Supreme Commander. He took the chair at every decisive committee. He dominated, first of all, the general staff, called the Stavka, which was composed of generals. He dominated the Military Council of Defense, which was composed mainly of his own satellite politicians. He also dominated the political body which ran internal Russia. He even was chairman of the committee which later on issued directions to the partisans. Indeed, you can really say it's an incomparable achievement that every line of policy had to run through Stalin's study, that Stalin alone made every great decision throughout the war, and many of the small ones as well. It's true that, unlike Hitler, he could distinguish between the great things and the small. He didn't worry about tactics. He perhaps did not worry enough about the details of equipment, though he grasped very early perhaps the most decisive weapon which the Russians were to use. Of course, he grasped about tanks, he grasped about aircraft, though the Russian aircraft, I think, were never of the highest quality. But he also grasped quite early, perhaps when the war had been going a year, that in the vast spaces of Russia, the greatest resource which would bring victory was the ability to move. And as early as, when was it? April 1942, he told the American representatives, we don't want any more tanks, what we want are trucks. And later on in the war, when the German armies were still entirely horse-drawn, as they were from beginning to end, the Soviet armies, or at any rate the crack troops, were all in jeeps. And if you ask why later in the war the Russians could move from one spot to another, it was the thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of American trucks for which Stalin had asked. Now, that's a wonderful stroke of penetration to appreciate how all the things they'd done before the war were out of balance. That unless he could deliver the chaps to the front, no amount of tanks would make the decision. Stalin continued for most of 1941 obsessed with this belief that the offensive was the only answer. And it brought upon the Soviet armies greater catastrophes, I suppose, than any armies have ever known. Between June 1941 and the tailing off of the German offensive, which came in October, the Russians lost something like 4 million dead, and at least 2 million Russian prisoners of war passed into German captivity, many of them then being murdered by the Germans. It was the inexhaustible human resources of Russia which kept them going. At one time, Halder, the German chief of staff, said, "We estimated that we should contend with 180 Russian divisions. We have already counted 350. These were ill-trained reservists, many of them, but they were growing to be crack troops. And in November 1941, Stalin did the immensely daring thing of bringing his forces from the Far East. He calculated that Japan, once she got locked in war against America, would not turn also against Russia. It's sometimes said that these forces saved Moscow. What is true is that the halt of the German armies in front of Moscow, when they were actually stopped and defeated for the first time by the Russian armies with Marshal Zhukov in supreme command in Moscow, marked, although nobody noticed it, or few people noticed it at the time, marked the real turning point of the war. The German invasion of Russia, just like the German invasion of France, was blitzkrieg. That is to say, to produce a decision immediately. At one time, the Germans thought they'd produce the decision by the end of July. They recognized they hadn't. They aimed again. German troops actually saw the towers of the Kremlin gleaming in the wintry sun. They reached the tram terminus, and there they were stopped, and during the winter driven back. Stalin still overestimated his successes. In December 1941, he told Eden, who was then visiting Moscow, "In a few months I shall have troops to join you in the Far East." There again, he was going to have to wait another 3 years at least before he could envisage doing this. And the Russian counteroffensive petered out. Both sides prepared for a further offensive. Here again, Stalin misjudged. He tried to attribute aims to the enemy rather than accepting that the enemy would have his own aims. I suppose one could say that Stalin's last great mistake was to insist on trying to disturb the German plans by an offensive of his own. It was the Russian offensive of March to May 1942 against Kharkov, which was catastrophic and which led to opening the whole of South Russia to German invasion forces. Stalin again refused to allow any kind of retreats. And as a result, most of the Russian armies were then lost. But it's also fair to say this was the last time that this mistake was made. In the summer of 1942, when the Russian armies were battered by the Germans, they retreated. I don't say that Stalin became less fierce to his commanders. He could be both fierce and then winning. On one occasion, this is very characteristic, he complained that Zhukov had not been sufficiently offensive. They had indeed a fierce argument in the Kremlin. And Zhukov finally said, "Well, I better resign then as chief of staff." Stalin said, "Yes, you better have and go and take command at the front." And Zhukov was still storming. It's said Zhukov was the only man who dared to argue with Stalin, though that's by no means true. In the later years of the war, many of the generals argued, though in the end they always gave way. But seeing that Zhukov was still in the temper, Stalin suddenly changed his whole nature, as it were, and smiled at him and said, "Comrade General, don't be too upset. These things happen to anybody in war. But your career has been successful. Now, let's sit down and have a cup of tea." And with this, he dismissed Zhukov to go after the front. I don't say that Zhukov ceased to be upset, but he had these strange ways of ups and downs. Sometimes, in the early days of the war, he was savage. He would ring up perhaps half a dozen generals whose armies had retreated during the way and tell them to come back to Moscow the same night. The next day, when they were back in Moscow, they were put before a court-martial and shot in the evening. Stalin, incidentally, was the only warlord of the Second World War who actually shot his generals for failure in the field. Hitler, of course, shot some generals who conspired against him, but that was something very different. And no wonder, and this was not the only reason, that the generals were all his absolute subordinates. There was never an instance of direct defiance. There were some who argued, some who evaded, but the combination of terror, of also, of course, enormous loyalty. After all, he was the boss. He was the center of everything. It's difficult to believe that any man could have accomplished the things he did simply from the physical point of view. Stalin, unlike any commander ever known, literally ran every front himself. He had three great fronts, one in Leningrad, one in the center at Moscow, one in the south, which went down to Stalingrad. And because they were all in his own empire, he could communicate with them and did so every night, often during the day as well. He spoke to the three chief commanders for a long time on the telephone every evening. He issued the orders for them next day. He sent them the details of the troops and supplies, and he knew them all, which he could provide. A most extraordinary picture of him, and at the same time having under his hands the domestic running of Russia, following all kinds of civil problems, economic problems, personally presiding over that vast shift of industry which went behind the Urals, and very often ringing up generals lower down and either encouraging them or sometimes rebuking them. But you never could tell with Stalin when the phone would ring, and when it rang, it was a warlord speaking and issuing directions. If there was a query, if one of the marshals even doubted him, he'd say, come back to Moscow, and the whole thing would be sorted out. But right through the war, Stalin's personal control was, I think, unique. In comparison, when you read of Hitler directing his war, certainly he directed the war, but it was done through a considerable staff. Very often his chiefs of staff, like Keitel and Jodl, issued the orders without consulting him. For long stretches of the day, Hitler was not active, and certainly for a great deal of the time, he was not in direct personal communication with the commanders-in-chief. Stalin was. There was never a moment from the time when the fronts became something like stabilized. There was never a moment when Stalin was not in complete personal control. For Stalin and for Stalin's character, I think that September 1942 was the decisive moment. It was then that he conferred with the two generals on the southern front when the German armies had already reached the outskirts of Stalingrad. Actually, we know when it was the 13th and 14th of September. And when he was discussing how Stalingrad could be defended, he heard them murmuring to themselves in the corner about something else, and he staggered them by the quickness with which he picked up what they were saying and said, what's that you say? Counteroffensive? And they said, well, yes, Comrade Stalin, we had thought that instead of just holding our own, we could cut the Germans off. And Stalin meditated, and he said, but this will mean a long delay. Yes, they said, 2 months. And he agreed. It was rather on a more limited scale in which Montgomery in North Africa had insisted on 2 months' delay before the Battle of El Alamein. Stalin was often impatient, often anxious. He would, I think, sometimes become apprehensive in the evenings and ring up and say, you're going to be too slow, the Germans are going to take Stalingrad. Then he would ring up the following morning and say, well, if you think it can be done, let it go ahead. And just as the Germans pulled off a wonderful strategic stroke at Sedan in May 1940, just as the Japanese would pull off a wonderful stroke at Pearl Harbor in December 1941, so the Russian counteroffensive, which was launched on the 20th of November 1942, was a strategical stroke of the greatest significance. A stroke far greater than the Russians expected. They thought they would take 90,000 prisoners. In fact, they took over 250,000. The whole German front was shattered. It was perhaps not until the following summer when Stalin finally displayed the way in which he had learnt patience, because once more there was a field of combat between the Germans and the Russians at Kursk, a very awkward Russian bulge or salient. In the old days, Stalin would have said, attack, break out. His generals persuaded him to wait. And it was the Germans who attacked, it was their army that was defeated. Without doubt, the Battle of Kursk was the decisive battle of the Second World War. It was from that moment on that the German armies lost their superiority. Incidentally, it was the greatest tank battle ever known in history, unless we are to count some of the battles which took place in the last Middle Eastern War, which was purely tanks. But these were battles of thousands of tanks and vaster infantry as well. From this moment on, Stalin was pursuing cautiously, never outrunning his resources, a series of victories. The Russians never had a defeat, though they often stopped. This is the thing that people don't allow for, that the whole concept of Stalin was not to go driving ahead, as the Germans had done, despite obstacles. Every time he came up against an obstacle, he stopped. This, among other things, produced the tragedy of Warsaw. The Soviet armies, the Red armies, had already stopped outside Warsaw when the Poles rose in revolt. And it would have demanded resources which at that time the Russians had not got to penetrate into Warsaw. He practiced the strategy of the indirect approach. At this time, too, Stalin became an international statesman. Consider that right up till 1939, when Ribbentrop, the German foreign minister, came to Moscow, Stalin had never met a statesman in the first rank. Anthony Eden visited him when still a junior minister. But a foreign secretary, a prime minister, he'd never met anyone of this kind. And he had to learn from scratch. He did not meet anyone else until first Eden came and then Churchill. And meeting Churchill, one might say, was the first time that Stalin had ever met a man of his own rank, a man who was also prime minister and of great power, of great character. And there's nothing perhaps more fascinating in the war than the way in which these two, so alien, and Churchill got his blow in very quickly of saying, well, you know, I was very hostile to you. I conducted the war's intervention against you after the First World War. I hope you've forgiven me. And Stalin, who incidentally started his life training in a theological seminary, said, very characteristic remark, it is for God to forgive. The two rowed at each other. On one occasion, when Stalin had provoked Churchill, Churchill began to answer and denounce him, and the interpreter couldn't keep up with what Churchill was saying. And Stalin said, don't bother. It doesn't matter what he's saying. I like his spirit. And for a time, there was, at any rate, an intimacy, as might say, of war. These two were engaged, and I think both agreed on one thing. People often talk about Stalin's political designs during the Second World War. They seem to think that communists never stopped from thinking about political conquest. In my opinion, Stalin could have said what Churchill said. I have only one aim in life, that is to beat Hitler. This makes everything simple for me. Stalin, far more, after all, than Churchill, had every reason to beat Hitler. He had lost what, or was to lose, 20 million Soviet people. People sometimes said there would be a compromise peace between Soviet Russia and Germany. This was inconceivable. The Russians and Stalin personally was set on total defeat, on exacting the unconditional surrender of the Germans long before Roosevelt formulated this. But he could do it also by diplomacy, and after all, it was his job to acquire for Russia the rewards of victory. If you read the accounts of the two great international meetings, first at Tehran in 1943, then at Yalta in 1941, when Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt conferred together. You feel that there was, with Stalin, a single-mindedness of purpose, a purpose of winning the war and making Russia secure thereafter. Roosevelt's mind was full of all kinds of optimistic ideas of the future. Churchill's mind, though very set on the war, was also full of the inspirations of the British Empire. Stalin was single-minded in planning victory. A number of those who were at the conferences remarked on the fact that both Churchill and Roosevelt brought a whole host of followers, advisors, that a lot of their stuff had to be provided for them by their chiefs of staff or whatever it might be. Stalin came with just 2 or 3 people who he would sometimes ask for information about, but he could do all the negotiating. He could discuss all the military problems, he could discuss all the political problems, and had an absolutely sheer, tight grasp of them. Whatever he'd been in earlier years, he grew up into being a statesman of, no doubt, totally devoted to the interests of his own country, but also of very great gifts, and in some ways of considerable sentiment and responsiveness. There were many who were struck by the way in which Stalin could take things easy. Mind you, he was set on victory, and he was always, in some ways, a savage. When he said that he thought 50,000 German officers should be shot immediately at the end of the war, I think this was not a joke, though he subsequently made out that it was. It's really how he felt. Incidentally, a more trivial instance of this, his form of humor. At one large party where there were a number of generals and diplomats and others, Stalin began to play up the generals and called out to one of them, Marshal Bulganin, "Bulganin, bring out the machine guns. Let us liquidate the diplomats." This was his form of fun. He could be quick and sympathetic in talking about it, but also in this brutal way. He had, I think, not envisaged anything at the end of the war except that Russia should be made stronger and more secure. As long as the war was on, right up perhaps to the defeat of Japan, he accepted cooperation with the Western powers. Whether he ever entertained the vision of a permanent cooperation of East and West is, I think, difficult to say. You could ask the same about the others. Churchill later on was to claim that he'd become disillusioned quite early. Stalin, I think, assumed, as so many people do, that the relations based on war would go on when the war was over, that there would still be the same feeling, well, we must agree because we are allies in a great war. But of course what happened is that when the war was over, there was no longer the same intensity of need to agree. And Stalin was very quick to respond into suspicion. And with this, in a sense, with the Potsdam Conference, where there was still the appearance of friendship, but perhaps no more, Stalin again becomes a mystery. He withdrew into Russia. The Cold War, whether his or America's, doesn't matter who started it, he was there again in the Cold War, and we know comparatively little of his last years. He became increasingly suspicious. The gifts, the brilliance which he showed seemed to vanish, and indeed, in the end, of course, many people think he became mad with suspicion, was proposing a vast new liquidation. When he died, he was treated as the greatest hero Soviet Russia had ever known. Thereafter, he was lowered and degraded. Characteristically, at first he was buried beside Lenin. Later, he was taken away altogether. He now has a more modest position but under the Kremlin wall. But the last word, perhaps, goes to Avril Harriman, who was American ambassador in Moscow for much of the war. He found Stalin better informed than Roosevelt, more realistic than Churchill, perhaps the most effective of the warlords.
Learn from the past to understand the present with an award-winning podcast. The rest is history. Listen on BBC Sounds.